So the topic we wanted to get into today is this idea of the challenge MSPs have with data analytics, KPIs, metrics, and such. And there's totally like this massive spectrum of where people are in their journey and what they're capable of doing. But one of the things that seems to happen a lot, and I hear the commentary regularly, is, oh, we're only using 10% of our PSA. People get started to start just using tickets, and they really don't delve deep enough, I guess, into some of the data. But Aaron, can you confirm this is something that you hear as well? The challenge of not really leveraging PSA to its full capacity.
Yeah, so we talk a lot about this big problem that's kind of always existed where every PSA has got some sort of saying that they come up with where it's like, get it all in. So it's ConnectWise world was, if it didn't happen in ConnectWise, it didn't happen and all this kind of stuff. And it makes sense because like this tool is running your entire business. Everything should be happening there, one source of truth, that whole thing. And so there's been this big push in getting the data in, but for some reason, and I've never really quite figured this part out, it's always been difficult to get that information out in like a usable way. And so because, we're IT people, like I grew up on the engineering side, like, oh, I can figure this out. And I do it like once a month at the end of the month, I would do a CSV dump and pivot table fun and all that kind of stuff. And then I would look up and it would be dark outside and I should have left and gone home 2 hours ago.
Oh man, you're bringing back some memories now.
Yeah, but it's just like a lot of work. And it's just like, this has got to be an easier way to do that. Reading
Yeah, no
Brian's
doubt.
comment right there.
Yeah. Oh, let me see the chat here.
He says the ERP for our industry.
Yeah, no
That's
doubt.
true. Yeah, and that's what's kind of funny. Like I talk to people outside of the MSP space, either like an investor or somebody that's used another system before, and they just have this expectation of deep level reporting and analytics that you can just pull out, and it's like maybe that exists in Salesforce, but it doesn't exist, or SAP or something. It doesn't exist in the MSP space. It's just it's just historically been really hard.
Yeah. And you'd think the PSAs themselves would have over rotated on this at some point to try and solve for the challenge. But I mean,
Yeah, my guess is it's just not a moneymaker for them. So once they got you in the system, they don't really have to. That part of it has just always kind of been in the backlog. So I've seen this kind of stuff on a roadmap forever on every PSA. I'm not picking on one or another, where it's just like you can just tell like product feature improvement requests is where they just dump their resources.
yeah, I've heard that comment too, Brian, that PSA is a loss leader. I think a lot of
That
I
makes
heard that
sense.
recently from one of the big vendors that have a big PSA, not to be named, but I think it's a challenge because there is sort of this expectation that once people are in a PSA, it's really hard to leave. So why bother? So getting to the data, obviously a lot of larger shops, and I have this. We had Pete Schultz last week talking about this. They're large enough that they can have a DevOps guy, doing constant API-driven reporting and analytics and merging and consolidating reports, and that's easy to do when you're that size. But the average MSP, according to Jay McBain, is 7 people. And there's almost never a person of that level at that size of MSP that can be dedicated to just doing that. So it becomes a real challenge to extract it early enough in the journey. But I think it's getting easier. Some of the tools like Zapier and whatnot are starting to sort of allow you to ping some of these things and grab the data, at least throw it into a spreadsheet that can do some kind of graphing for you on a regular basis. But even then, that still requires a ton of maintenance and care and just oversight, because it's going to break. Something in the PSA is not set up the same way. And I think one of the stories I heard from Christy is that, and by the way, for everybody, Christy is who does a lot of the support and onboarding primarily for Cognition. And one of the things that I hear her say the most is how much they have to sort of pull back out to the 30,000 foot view and reassess how the MSP is using the PSA in the first place, because a lot of things are often set up incorrectly. There's no real standard that's kind of across the industry as far as finance and GL accounts and things like that. And so, I mean, where do we start with sort of standardizing a bit of this approach to metrics?
Yeah, that's a big challenge for us. So we hear a lot of usually the same issues. So it's all kind of related to, most people come to us because they want to kind of understand their business a bit better. So when what does that really mean? So when we peel back the onion, it's kind of like, well, you're not accounting for your costs in some way. And so our biggest cost as MSPs is time. It's not the dollar agent that I have to buy from this vendor. It's usually time, aka your engineers fixing all this stuff. And so having a way to kind of figure out like how much that is, because we have so many interactions with a client on a daily basis from different engineers that are getting paid different amounts, and there's different levels of difficulties that are in all of those tickets that they're working on. So like getting the handle around that is usually where I see that's where you need to start. So what we do is we make all that stuff easy for people from do the back end work. But in terms of, you still have to go out and work the data. Like you have to take action on what you see. And I talk about that quite a bit. But one of the biggest things that I see that people can do that makes an immediate change is measuring that time capacity, and just kind of understanding, is everybody getting time into the system? Who's putting time in? I see so many times like you are your number one customer. So it's like meetings and trainings and doing back end stuff. And a lot of people, even if they're not accounting for that, that's just what you can kind of assume is in there. So it's time culture is so important in a business in the MSP space for sure. I see that so much.
Well, I was at Seven Figure this week. The Seven Figure MSP is interesting because, of course, they focus on the sales and marketing aspect of trying to get MSPs to evolve a bit. And one of the things Chris Weiser said during one of his talks was kind of the thing that hit home is, hey, you can if you want to continue crawling under desks, hire a CEO. And I think this is sort of the perennial issue of the distractions that exist in our MSPs, of course, because every single high urgency reactive thing is going to take us away from dealing with some of this stuff, of course. And so if that's a challenge for your business today, obviously you may not be the best person to be leading the charge, of course, if what you really enjoy is the technology piece. But Brian, go ahead.
I was at an event recently that had a lot of educational content. And one of the things they talked about when you're kind of diving into the resource utilization, right? How efficient are your resources being used? Where's their time being spent? And I don't know if this is messaging that you would want to tell the rest of your staff, but you almost want to look at your employees' time as like inventory that's on the shelf.
For sure. Yep.
Right. It shows up on the shelf every day. You either use it or lose it. And how you used it is going to determine profitability. And we focus so much on, selling the servers, workstations, SaaS services, and what type of markup are we getting on those, right? Because that's a physical product or a service. And we don't realize that the staff we have is throwing 8 hours a day of their time on an inventory shelf. And are we paying attention to how that's being used and whether or not it's benefiting the company the best?
Yep.
Right.
Yeah, that's funny you say that. I use that exact same analogy because people will start using reporting or any phase, and it's like, well, how do I get people to start putting it in? Because usually it's that your number one ticket crusher is the guy that's worst at putting time in, and so you don't want to just let him go. You don't want to draw a line in the sand. So what are methods you can do to do that? And so one of the things that I actually tell people do, and I've talked people through this kind of thing, have that, first you got to measure it and show them, but then it's, well, you just want to micromanage me, or you just want to, I'm just doing all this extra busy work. It's not real. Like I don't really need to do it. And it's to use the inventory analogy. And I actually use iPads as that analogy. Like you are actually paying your engineers for individual, I'm buying 8 hours from you every day. and then I'm selling that 8 hours in some other way. So I'm buying and reselling this time, and it might be in a fixed agreement format, but that's my cost, is I'm buying those 8 things from you. And if I take those 8 things and like, let's change that from hours to, let's just say you make iPads. You make 8 iPads a day, and that's your job. And then I'm buying those from you and going to sell them out. So if you make 8 iPads for me every day, and then at the end of the day, I come and say, hey, how'd that go? Oh, we had a great day. Okay, well, I only see where you accounted for 3 of those iPads that you sold. Where's the other 5? How long is that going to go on before we have a pretty big problem and we can't grow this business anymore, because you're literally letting inventory just leak out the door? And when you have that kind of conversation with people, especially like engineer people, and they have that, there's sometimes that light that goes off, sometimes not. But where it's just like, oh, that's why this makes sense and why this is so important. That inventory thing, that's great that you brought that up.
I want to ask a question about the flip side of value creation, because this is, I feel like when people don't understand their impact necessarily, and closing tickets is one thing, but I think you lose the sensibility or the feeling to the impact when that's all you're doing to some extent. And so it's easy to lose a bit of that degree of connection that you have to the impact for the clients or what have you. And so like there was a time when I would argue that we're trying to sell to clients based on value, but we're trying to buy based on time. And there's maybe an intrinsic mismatch in understanding what the value creation component of that is, from the text perspective. And so I find that sometimes if we are able to have that conversation about what does value creation mean to them, sometimes it helps, I think, understand why that link is important. But anybody else have a story of how they've succeeded in getting text to enter time, or is everybody flailing? Go ahead and jump in. I know there's stories.
I think for mine, I just showed him the books. I'm like, we're taking a gamble, right? If you do all in seat pricing, you're taking a gamble of how many hours you spend on that client per month, essentially, right?
When you say you show them the books, like, what do you mean, financial books?
Yeah, like, well, this is how much money we're making on this client per month. If we go over this, we lose money on this client, and then therefore we can't get tools, we can't get additional staff, you don't get a raise, and then you don't get a bonus. And so
Profitability.
if there's no time entered, there's this clear disconnect between this is too much profitability, this isn't real data, and then we discredit it. So that's what our approach was, and it seems to be working well for our side. It's like, and I just chatted, like, once they get why we're needing them to do it, it seems like the what just falls right into place.
Yeah, that value creation is kind of what I was trying to say about the why. Thanks for elegantly stating it. Totally. And so I think this is an interesting challenge. Of course, we are our own worst enemies because, we're the smartest people in the room and we know how to figure this out, but we just never can really focus the time necessary to drive it long-term consistently. And this is a challenge in many areas, I think, for MSPs, again, due to the reactive nature of some of the other things that always come up. And it's not until there's, I guess, a layer of management that can really be focused on some of these outcomes that it becomes a little bit easier to keep an eyeball on those things. But again, the sub 10-person MSP who doesn't typically have a service desk leader or doesn't typically have a management person that can really keep an eye on these things, I think it is more challenging. So I think the process becomes super important. Go ahead, Brian.
So you touched on this earlier. And we're only a 13-person MSP, but we have a four-person leadership team, and we're really focused on handling a lot of leadership items that you typically wouldn't see with our size company. And the minute I jump into a product like Cognition 360, I quickly realized, wow, we have a lot of data cleanup we got to do, or we need to be doing things more consistently across our clients, so that when we go to report in depth on this data,
Right.
we're not having to make specific notes on all these fringe cases on why things look different across our clients, right? So I do feel like there's almost an opportunity where, you know, for a product like Cognition 360, first step is like, let's get your data ready to even report on and figure out what you may not be tracking that you need to start tracking to really get value.
Yeah.
And so that was a big hurdle that we've still been getting over. We're almost there where we could potentially use a product like that, because now we can rely on our numbers, you know, and not question why they might look so off with a certain client, you know.
Yeah, interestingly, you know, from last week's call, and what you're saying is kind of a bit of the standardization of process. And I think to some extent, you know, it applies a layer of equality to the way you work with all clients to some extent. And it kind of makes it more difficult to have clients that fall outside of that process or that way of doing business or that way of tracking. And then Pete Schultz last week sort of was interesting. Kind of, he gave a little bit of a maybe different perspective, which was this idea that, of course, and this is across many industries and businesses, that 80% of their business comes from 20% of their clients. But some clients just are not necessarily on the same maturity, I guess, spectrum as the others. And so they have to make adjustments. But unless they want to let the client go, then they kind of have to figure out ways to more creatively work with different clients in different ways. And I've seen many larger MSPs also continue to do, you know, break fix in some scenarios versus all in seat pricing. And so it's an interesting situation. Paul Dipple certainly argues that, you know, all in seat pricing, same product, one product offering for all clients at all times is the most operationally efficient anyways, because you don't have to deviate and create all these menu items for different clients. But I think if you learn to do that well, you can still be successful in both areas, no doubt. And so the eyeballing of service boards is certainly true. Like, I think people love dashboards, and I think they become sort of obsessed with that instant visibility. But in your experience, Aaron, does that really tell the trending story of any of the sort of long-term efforts that need to be made?
Yeah, I mean, I think because I imagine this doesn't happen in other industries, but maybe it does. But I think when you get some sort of tool or any ability to report on your data, I just see people go way overboard and they're just build 300 different gauges or visuals or whatever, without any kind of thought into like, should we be using this stuff and what is the math behind it? And oh, somebody's going to have to maintain this number and this KPI because we're actually going to use it. And so one thing that we go through at Cognition when we were early on, when we were building the product, is which KPIs are we going to put in there? So if you listen to thought leadership over here, it's like, oh, just the simple 500 KPIs you should be looking at as a service manager. And it's just kind of like, whoa. And there are all these options about doing it, and it's not like any of them are wrong. And so I think what we talk about a lot of Cognition when we build stuff into the product is there a way that this can be actionable and you can actually do something? Because we had that problem at my MSP a lot. I've used every dashboarding reporting tool that was available at the time. And we would throw it up on the TV. This is back when people actually were going in the office. We would throw it up on the TV and it would look beautiful on the TV. And I could show it off to a client, but no one in the office was looking at it. In fact, I would change it manually and see if people even noticed, and nobody even said a word. And so it got to be, and that was like a TV problem, but it was also a metric problem. Like, this stuff doesn't really matter. It just is interesting. And so, okay. And here's an example. I had an MSP ask me for if we could build a KPI that showed them how many tickets they closed last year. And I was like, okay, so let's just say that number is 22,000. What are you going to do? Like, what are you going to do with that information? Because there's so much information overload that comes out. And maybe this is why there's always been hesitancy on getting the data out. It's just been, so just making them actionable and manageable is something that's been so critical. And I'm a big fan of the less is more when it comes to that. Like I tell people, like when they start with a cognition, as a cognition customer, we talk about 2 or 3 KPIs, just really dig your teeth into. And we've got some top ones that we kind of recommend and things like that, but don't try to do it all at once. It's just way too much. And work the data. So you go and, okay, this is a number and it should be up here. And that's the other thing, is like, what is good? So having a way to kind of define that on whatever that metric is really important. And then us being IT people, we get overly focused, I think, on ticket metrics, because it's easy to close 38 tickets, but it's not easy to make 38% margin on a client sometimes. And so I see a lot of like ticket closure rates and that kind of stuff. And it's like, okay, well, that's kind of interesting. What are you going to do with that information? Kill rate's another one I see is pretty popular that people like to do. And it's not like anything is wrong with those per se, but if that's the one that you're mainly focusing on, like, let's say you get really, really good at that. What is that going to do to your business? Because a lot of times it's those other metrics that you care about. And so like the general, if you guys are owners on here and it's like, hey, we've got the best kill rate in the town. Like, okay, does that mean that you're the most profitable? Does that mean that you're probably not? It probably means that you just close tickets really fast. And of course, you get good at all your service metrics. You're going to provide good service, but you might have to close doors tomorrow because your pricing's wrong. You're doing it for $40 a user or something like that.
Another interesting stat actually that came from Seven Figure this week is that the average seat price that a lot of MSPs come into the Seven Figure group to try and improve is about $68 a seat. And that kind of, to some extent, explains why, according to Peter Kujawa from SLI, 31% of MSPs
it's hard to make money at that price. Yep.
Yeah. And I don't, and part of the challenge, no doubt, is that I think MSPs in the early stages have difficulty attaching, value to the work. And I think there's sort of a self-discovery process that everybody goes through there. I don't feel good charging that amount. The hero factor, I think, plays a role. Is like, my clients won't pay that. We're applying our own financial values to the clients when, clearly we just don't know what we're talking about until we learn. But in terms of metrics, I'm sure there's some key things that are contributing to this factor. And I think you've said it already, like the non-actionable data is just keeping us busy looking at interesting things, but not anything that's actually actionable.
Yep, for sure. Yeah, you hope those MSPs that lost money didn't know it was coming, at least.
As opposed to
otherwise it's a completely different problem.
Yeah. I think there's also the challenge of especially in early stage. I think a lot of MSPs get their start with the break fix model, and then they're hitting the glass ceiling. They can't work more hours, but they're trying to change the billing model, move into all in seat pricing, recurring revenue, and all that. But I see a big challenge also in the data metrics of like, how do these things matter with a break fix business versus a recurring all in seat pricing business? Aaron, is there any significant difference there, you think?
The difference in what now? Break fix and what?
Just the applicability of the metrics in a break fix versus all in seat pricing, recurring revenue type of model.
Oh yeah. The problem is those are completely opposite business models. So it's the old ways. What me and my friends called the good old days was in theory, the worse you were, the longer it took you to repair a PC, the more money you'd make. And you switch to the fixed fee service, and obviously that is up on its head. So now it's all about, let's be as efficient as possible. It's not like, hey, we auto close all tickets when they come in and good job, because obviously you still got to retain that client. But it switches completely around. And so when you're looking at metrics for different sides of the business, make sure you're using different metrics to look at the hourly and T&M. And so if you're, especially if you're kind of seeking out acquisition, and whether that's on buy side or sell side, in general, you're going to want to beef up your recurring revenue versus your time and materials revenue. So looking at that from a percentage standpoint is something that's pretty critical, because you don't want your T&M to overtake your recurring revenue, especially for tough times. Yeah, so from what I see a lot of people doing with T&M is they don't even track it anymore, other than the percentage difference that I was talking about,
Right.
because it frankly just doesn't really matter. Because okay, we can bill all this client, and the only thing the client's going to do is complain about, oh, this took you 10 hours to do instead of 6. To me, that was always a conversation starter for, I'm glad you pointed that out. Let me talk to you about a better plan for you, and moving them over to that. So I would kind of wait for a client to get a big bill, and hey, you know what? I'll retroactivate this agreement to, and it will cover this amount. So you can just pay this fixed amount going each month. That was a great conversation starter for that.
I like that strategy, by the way. Never heard of doing that, but
I used
Brian.
it a lot.
So this is a challenge. We got lucky moving from break fix to managed support. We actually did it in the 08 crash, when all of our clients needed fixed expenses, and we knew we needed fixed income, right, to survive. And so we kind of went back to our proactive clients and said, this is what you have been spending with us. And we created like a formula on that, right? But as I dug into it deeper, you're exactly right. The break fix model is actually a conflict of interest in our industry.
Oh yeah.
We don't have a mechanics book that you can open up that says when you you change this transmission, it takes 1 hour. So even if you do it in a half hour, you're still going to charge 1 hour, right? So, when you have a model like that, efficiency, you can still charge hourly and make it, because you're going off of a rule book at that point.
Right.
But where's my incentive to want to invest money to train my engineers to get things done quicker if all that equals is less hourly billing,
right.
Which means then I normally would have to stack even more clients that I can't handle because of our size, just to make up for the loss of revenue, for the fact that I now invested money for my engineers to do things more efficiently, right? It's a complete conflict of interest when you think about it from a high.
Yeah, the whole model is designed for there to be animosity, because all that's happening is because you're worried about overbilling and they're worried about you overbilling, and so then they become hesitant to call you, which is the opposite of what they should be doing if they're having an IT problem. So if they don't call you, then they're going to have bigger problems later. It's obviously headed for disaster. And then you don't want to buy tools that they need to support them, RMM agents, et cetera, because they're just hourly. Like, who knows what's going to happen? So it's always been a managed services just crushes it almost every time. I think, I was, there was some podcast, I can't remember what I was listening to, but it was talking about the MSP generational divide. And I was like, whoa, what does that even mean? But it was talking about these newer MSPs that are coming out, in the past few years, who have never gone, they don't have the battle scars of going from the hourly model to the managed services model and all that kind of entails. And so they don't even know what it was like back then. And I was like, man, I feel really old now.
I love Dustin's comment, because I think despite it being despite it being in our best interest in a break fix model to have stuff break again, I think it's also against our values and morals as the IT hero for that to happen. And so we're literally dragging ourselves down into the hole further every time. And so, yeah, it's an interesting challenge to address just from a mindset perspective, no doubt. Let's see what we can talk about here. Any comments, ideas, questions from anybody so far? Because I mean, this is a deep topic. I mean, this is the kind of thing you could converse about for hours, and there's so much philosophical nuance to it. But I think the metrics component, Aaron nailed it. This idea of how all these metrics are super interesting, but they do absolutely nothing to sort of help you understand where to grow the business necessarily. But we love the data, and we love seeing it in the shiny dashboards. You know, we would always take pictures of post server rack builds and share them around because of the blinky lights. I mean, who doesn't love a rack full of blinky lights, right? And I think the idea of all these metrics in many ways is the same. Let's talk about some of these top KPIs. I think that's an interesting thing to get into, because if you had only, you know, you mentioned 2 or 3, and if you could only start with a couple things to try and make a dent in the operational efficiency stuff, you know, you mentioned these to me earlier, Aaron. Maybe let's go through each one of these. And what are some of the challenges with this team utilization? Why is this? Well, the inventory analogy I think covered that really well, but PSAs seem to not really deliver on this metric as is currently.
Yeah, and it's kind of hard to track that kind of stuff. I see a lot of people put like rounded time in, and I think I saw somebody mention earlier about when you switch to this model, it becomes even more important to be exact as you can. So generally speaking, it's good to get a culture around getting it in there. But just because you get a capacity in there doesn't mean, all right, we're good on that KPI. Because capacity could mean hey, I put in my time, and you go look at what he did, and he watched Netflix for 8 hours, and he put that in there. So capacity doesn't necessarily mean you're good, but that's the first step. And so you get the quantity of time in, and then you got to get into the quality of that data, and how that gets in there. So before like tools like Cognition and stuff were around, what I used to do is like spot check time entries. And you're looking for, hey, is this something that you actually did during this time? Is your time close? Is your time, do you have these big overlapping time entries where you're just kind of not paying attention? What I would see a lot is, of course, people putting in time way after they did the work, and not being accurate about it, because you know, everybody's like, oh, I'll put that time in when I get home. Yeah, sure. And then the next morning they're scrambling to put it in and just kind of putting something in real quick. So just the amount of time to put it in and having good process around that. But you can't do all that stuff. You can't implement those processes unless you're measuring this stuff. So that's kind of, we get back. This is kind of like this chicken and the egg type thing where it's, and I think it was Brian that brought it up, where it was, hey, we got to get our data ready, and then we'll be ready to kind of measure towards this stuff. But then it's good to know kind of where you're going, what the destination is before you kind of get in the car kind of deal. And so what generally it's just, you got to start measuring something. So I just picked top 5 KPIs for the whole MSP here and put them down. We talk about the 2 or 3 rule on a more per role standpoint. Mm-hmm. So like a service manager might have 2 or 3, owner might be, but for me, if I was an owner of a small MSP, this is the things that I would want to focus on. My team utilization, which is what we just talked about, expensive tickets. That to me is something that's kind of always this elusive, like, how do we figure this stuff out? But an expensive ticket doesn't necessarily mean it's the 40-hour ticket. It could mean I have got my top engineer that I pay the most to fix a password reset issue. And so obviously that's something that I should get a level 1 engineer to fix, and figuring that kind of stuff out. Average time to time entry. So that's from the time the ticket comes in until the time we actually work on the ticket or put a time entry in. To me, that was like always the most important metric that was always kind of hard to track, because that's what the customer cares about. So it's kind of really correlated to that bottom metric, the CSAT tool. Mm-hmm. Because the customer doesn't care that you met your SLA within your own PSA, or our response plan was met, or just name whatever is service level agreement type stuff. They don't even understand what those terms are. So all they care about is, I had this problem, I told you about it, how long did it take you to get to me? So that's the average time to time entry. Do you guys have a way to track that now? You do?
I suppose it depends on the PSA and what built-in reporting exists, but yeah.
Yeah, typically that's tracked. Well, I know in Autotask anyway, it's when you set up your SLA, right? It's kind of when all of that gets triggered and tracked.
Is that
So
based on the time you're working in it, or is it like
So
the
you
time we
set,
assign the
you
ticket
can
out?
set
Or...
multiple SLAs based on what service it may be, but they did their first metric is time to first response, right? They track the
Right.
time it came in, and then they start a timer. And based on your SLA, you should be responding to that within a certain amount of time. And if you don't, then it creates a red flag.
Right. As long as that response is like a real response is what this
Yeah.
metric is about.
Yeah.
Not a, hey, we got your ticket, thanks.
And it is very easy to fool the system that way. You're right.
Right.
So you got to look for people gaming the system,
Yeah.
you know?
Oh,
Yeah.
I'll get to this in a couple hours. Yeah, just a no response. Yeah.
Yeah.
No response.
Let me back up to expensive tickets for a second, because I think another interesting piece of this is the categorization of issues,
Oh yeah.
which strikes me as one of those things that people sometimes let slide. They might do a little bit of high level customization of ticket categories, but this is I think an area where almost every MSP diverges. Like there's literally no industry standard here, and people call different things whatever. And so I mean, your comments on the missing categorization in terms of understanding expensive tickets.
I've seen people get in fights over what categories they should have in their PSA. In a boardroom, it was a weird event, but there's definitely. I think it's just more important to make it simple and make it so you use it. And so there's different automations and that kind of thing you could do within whatever PSA you have based on what categories you choose. But from a reporting and KPI standpoint, this is where this information is like gold. Like where, hey, we've spent, and when I say expensive tickets, so if you take that time that a technician puts in a ticket and you convert that to an hourly cost, and then you could say, well, we've got all of these engineers working on all of these different types of tickets, but we've got these tickets categorized, and this technician works on it for 15 minutes, another expensive technician works on it for 45 minutes. There's a cost for that ticket. And if you take that ticket and have it categorized, then you can look at all your categories and figure out what are we paying these technicians to do? Is it just resetting passwords? Is it fixing email problems? Is it installing desktops? So what I see usually when all those data points are kind of correlated together is desktop installs, backup related issues that just eat you away. And then the other one is, God, what was I gonna say? Email related issues like forwarding email tickets, changing email, basic email administration. Because for some reason, expensive engineers tend to get involved in those, because I don't know if it's a training issue or what, but from a data perspective, that's what we see a lot.
Brian, you're muted.
Sorry, window was under my start menu, the mute button. This has been a topic of discussion for us as of late. I mean, when we first dove into, auto task calls and issues and sub issues, it was like, hey, we're going to think of anything and everything that could ever happen, and we're going to build out this huge list, right? And it was almost like, hey, we're managing inventory. What's every category of inventory we might have that we're going to manage? Let's just put that in.
Counterproductive. Yeah.
Very common.
Right.
Yep.
And now what we've realized, and to your point, Aaron, on kind of what you just talked about, is we're looking at moving towards more aligning our issues and sub issues with skills that we're also tracking in the PSA. So what skill level is needed to address this ticket? And can we put a label on that? And can we develop a training package around that? And then can we assign that skill to an engineer that we know can do it? And at that point, when you're dealing with triage of incoming real life tickets that actually come in, not just a full inventory database of everything that could possibly happen in the world, now you've got better triage guidance on maybe who this should go to based on either the skill requirement or the fact that you don't want to put an expensive resource on it, right? It's
Yep.
kind of that idea.
That's interesting.
You, Brian, out of curiosity, do you currently have issues and sub issues required to be able to
Yes.
edit or update a ticket? Yeah.
Yep. Yeah.
And I find this is another one. People are caught by surprise by this because they may not have those issues and sub issues lists or categories lists figured out. And then they just remove the requirement for those just so they can get started. And then they just never get around to it. And then you have none of the data available when you want it. And it's impossible to go back to historically understand anything that happened, of course.
So I guess one last takeaway on my comment is if you're looking for a place to start that is truly low-hanging fruit, look at the past 6 months of tickets that you've received and try to understand how you categorize those while keeping skill in mind, right? L1, L2, L3. And you know, maybe you've got 2 email problems that might come in and have the same issue, sub issue, but one of them is more drastic. It's an email server versus an email client. So split those out because naturally you're going to have an L3 on the email server versus maybe an L1 on the email client, right?
The other thing you can do with that information, so obviously there's a, hey, where are we dumping all of our time and kind of helping that craft your service delivery model. The other thing that you can do with that information about what are we working on and what are the types of the things that come in most is when you're hiring for your next technician. I see a lot of people do stuff like, oh man, we just hired a guy and he can do layer 3 switching. I was like, great. How much layer 3 switching problems do you have?
Yeah. Or how many clients do you have actually using layer 3 switching?
That even have a switch that can do layer 3.
Yeah, we're gonna make work projects for him to switch every client to layer 3 switching.
And it's like most of what you do is going to be that easier stuff. That's obviously why they're level 1. Now, I'm not saying don't ever hire level 3, but it's not as big a problem as you think. I've even seen MSPs where they don't even have level 3, and they have some Bob they call when layer 3 switching comes up once every 4 years. Everybody needs a Bob.
Yeah, I guess it depends on your level of MSP snobbiness is what I would call that. when I got started, I wanted to put in Cisco everywhere because nobody ever got fired for buying Cisco. But that meant I also went down the rabbit hole of Cisco iOS and all the other bullshit that comes with that. And then I wanted layer 3 switching at every client. And then when you try to sell them a $15,000 switch versus an $800 Ubiquiti, the conversation is just like there's no place you can take that conversation. Managing stale tickets was second to last one here. What are your comments on that, guy?
Managing stale tickets. So a lot of people have, and I can't remember exactly how it works in Autotask, but boards that are like tickets go to die here. And so what a lot of people will do is, hey, what's going on with that ticket? And they see somehow it's in this, graveyard area of the PSA. And okay, well, let's get rid of the graveyard areas. And then you just muddy up your whole active workflow. And so like having a way to manage that from a ongoing perspective. So kind of some of this kind of gets into SLA configuration and that kind of thing. But from a reporting standpoint, knowing usually what you see is engineers that'll do this kind of thing where it's a certain engineer and he'll have 30% of his tickets are over 100 days old. And it's like, well, we need to get that guy some help, or he's cherry picking tickets a lot. And nobody's in there kind of managing his queue. And so just having a way to easily see that. And part of this is defining like what is a stale ticket, and kind of having different routes for that. But just being able to constantly report and that be part of your, weekly tech meeting, or we show this once every so often to the technicians so they know that we're measuring it and they didn't just disappear.
Yeah. I love that. I remember the graveyard well. Okay, so lastly, CSAT. I think CSAT is an interesting one. If as a small shop that I was for a long time, 2 people, 3 people, CSAT was almost silly to do because that's how I felt. And I'm not saying it's silly to do, period, but because I'd have people responding to tickets that I had closed only for me to be the, executioner of, a good or bad review. And so I think clients were like, well, I can just tell you. And so there was no, I guess, managerial oversight there to address where CSAT was concerned. So we turned it off.
Awesome.
And when we became 6, 7 people, we started doing it again. But tell me a little bit about your thoughts on the data piece of CSAT.
Yeah. So on the CSAT side, from a reporting standpoint, well, let me just back up a second. What I'm not talking about is having an actionable way to manage that CSAT stuff. So something comes in, you need to have a process for how that's managed every time. And whether that's a good response and this is what we do, or bad response, this is what we do. That's critical to have a process, not just kind of fly by the seat of your pants. Because at some point that's going to scale, and you don't want to take an emotional response to it every time, because that's, especially if it's about you, in your case, Luis, you want, hey, this is the process that we follow. And I don't mean like canned auto verbiage, but I mean, hey, somebody gets involved, we pick up the phone, we call them, whatever that is. But from a reporting standpoint and looking at the data, again, kind of correlating that back to either other data points is where, to me, this starts to get interesting and actionable. Meaning, hey, are there different types of tickets that we're working on, back to my categories, that usually kick back a bad response? Well, maybe our service delivery is bad at that. Maybe we're not good at deploying new desktops. Maybe we're winging it because everybody's upset because we forgot to install this app for this law client, and this is how they track time. And Susie at the law place is upset because she's told us this 4 times. So it helps you with your own service delivery model. And then the other thing to correlate it to is pricing and profitability on that client. So usually what I see is clients with low margin, there's a data correlation between we're not making money and they're upset. So that's because they probably have, stuff that's not aligned to our stack or terrible equipment, and they haven't been doing what we want them to do. So it takes us more time to manage them. And ironically, and usually that means it's custom. So there's only one guy that can service them. So meaning that they have to wait longer. So all those things correlate together. Some of the newer insight type stuff that's looking at CSAT is less of a, hey, we're going to send you a survey to respond to that, and more like looking at, it's using like AI to look at ticket sentiment and kind of figuring out if the customer's upset or not. So that's cool and interesting, but it's important to take that data and be able to correlate, okay, they are upset, handle that individually, but more comprehensively, why are they upset? Or
Love
happy.
that. Well, and look at that, just looked at the clock, and we are 5 minutes from the top of the hour. How this can easily rabbit hole into an interesting discussion is fascinating. Last comments from anybody? Questions? Are you struggling with a KPI? Do you want Aaron's advice on anything? He offers free personal consulting on the weekends. He tracks the time.
I do track the time.
All right. Well, I think with that, we'll try to wrap up. Thanks, Brian, for your engagement. Great questions and comments. The chat is super interesting as well. Thanks, Greg, for your comments. Oh, there's a question from Greg here. Are you planning an LCI roadmap topic for our Friday roundtable anytime soon? Actually, yes. So next Friday, we have Adam Hurt, our VP of product, and Andrew Day, our product manager, who oversees LCI now, coming in. And so definitely, if you have feature conversations or roadmap conversations or ideas, definitely come by next Friday, and we'll try to get into that. And Brian, you had asked a question earlier as well, which is, what is the ETA on auto task support for cognition? And that was a question for Aaron.
I see 2 have dropped off. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, we're working on it. So it's I would say we were originally shooting for end of this year. It's already almost September, so I'm not sure that's going to happen. But we're getting close. We've been through, just for a quick bunch of boring history that you might not be interested in. We went through this whole process before, and then Kaseya acquired them, and then we had to go through this whole certification process again after we were like 90% there. And so that kind of slowed things down to a snail's pace, and now we're kind of picking up steam again as far as that's concerned. But we are, that is definitely on the roadmap, and we're working on it.
Brian will be a happy customer of Cognition when Autotask support comes out.
Great.
Excellent. Well, thanks again, everybody. Remember, we do have that open demo on the 31st. If you are on ConnectWise Manage and would love to see Cognition a little bit more closely, that's with Christy. And then don't forget to sign up for that masterclass series. All of this stuff is at skillpad.com/events. And I think these will be the types of conversations we're having near the masterclass events, along with another MSP that has a deep experience, in that particular category. And trying to get into some of the challenges and whatnot. So, Aaron, thanks so much again for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is great. Good to see you all.
Your expertise on this, and thanks everybody for hanging out once again. And we'll hope to see you all next Friday.
All right, see y'all.
Cheers.
Bye, everyone.
Ciao.